Okay, so today I'm going to paint a picture of a sunset on Walton Street. What you're seeing now is I'm laying in the fractals, or rule of thirds as some people call it, on a gray ground. I've gessoed the board with gray ground. It's a 1620 board, and so I'm on the left on the iPad. You see the photograph that I'm working from. So this is just charcoal on the Now I'm laying in the sky, just getting rid of all the big areas of gray where I know there's going to be a different color, and I'm presuming that the sky is going to reflect on the street in a similar fashion because it's sunset, and the sky is that rich warm color, which this isn't, but later on I'm going to paint it a little warmer and warm it up. And the sun is setting just about the horizon line, which is where the street meets the sky up there. That's about where the sun is. So these are my grays. And the grays are mixed by making a combination of orange and phthalo, orange and blue, ultramarine blue, and just a regular strong orange. And then I make a second set of grays by mixing a green, a turquoise green, with permanent crimson. And I find that the turquoise green with permanent crimson yields a black. And then you dilute it with white and it yields a warm or a cool gray, depending on whether you have more permanent crimson or more green in it. Now I'm going to lay in some of the reds on the buildings. These buildings are all red brick and yellow brick, so they're a red brick, yellow brick, red brick, sort of alternating. And I also have to be a little bit careful about what's in shadow and what's in sun, because the sun is very low in the sky. So what we're going to see is that some of the tops of the buildings are going to get skimmed in sunset light, which is very, very warm. And that's what this red is here. I know it's going to be in sunset light. And then below it, I put a darker red, which is going to be in shadow. And I'll probably have to adjust those later on. But just for now, I'm going to try those two. And then from there, I'm going to move over and address the yellow. And I start with a very bright yellow because the sun is very intense in the sky. So I'm just screwing around here, and I'm not very good at editing, so you're having to watch me screw around a lot. Okay, here comes the bright sunlight. This is the tops of the buildings, and that line that I'm creating there is the shadow line, where the sun is hitting the buildings on the left-hand side of the street and casting shadows. So the sun is going to be very, very bright up top with the bright red and the bright yellow. And this is azo yellow with a little bit of white, and it's pretty intense. And it's more, frankly, it's more intense than I thought it was going to be. And I'm making the shapes of the cast shadows, just taking a bit of care, because they kind of look like buildings, and I didn't want it to look like it wasn't a cast shadow of a building. And then below it, I'm going to put in the darks. And I'm going to fuck that up because I'm going to put in a dark that's a bit too dark. And later on, I'll have to make an adjustment to that as well. But when you're painting, fucking it up is not a big deal, because, especially in acrylics, because you can always go back and paint over it because it dries so quickly. And if it's in oils, you can scrape it out. Part of the reason I use acrylics is because I'm a trained watercolor painter, and just waiting for the oil to dry forever is just not my thing. So here you see I put in the shadow, and it looks like a cast shadow, but because the sun is so bright on the top of the buildings, I had two choices. I could either darken the yellow, or I could lighten the dark blue shadow below. And later on I'm going to lighten the dark blue shadow because I didn't want to lose the bright yellow. And then I'm going up the street. This is a scene that goes uphill, and the perspective is tricky as hell going uphill because you have multiple horizon lines in a sense, or multiple vanishing points. Like each building moves up the street, so because it moves up the street, it's actually the shorter the building, the shorter buildings on the top of the street in the far distance are actually shorter than the buildings just in the foreground here, but they end up being almost at the same height because you've got to keep adjusting your vanishing point, even though the horizon line and point of view is kind of fixed, which is why it looks as if you're going uphill. I'm warming up the buildings on the shadow side because they just looked a little dead. Even though they're in shadow, they look really, really dead. So when I put this red in, I think that fixes it up a lot. And I'm going to add even more red later on. I'm putting in darks. The poles, the lamp posts are going in, and they're in a funny perspective as well because their vanishing points keeps disappearing. And I've got a car in the foreground, and I put that windshield in black just to start with and see how that goes. Now there's a bridge. I'm standing on a bridge, so putting in the bridge posts here and the railing for the bridge that people, if you were in Paris and you wanted to commit suicide, this is the bridge that you'd jump over, I suppose. These are the railings that you vault over, and in Porto probably wouldn't work very well because the water's only 6 inches deep at this time of year. Oh, you'd probably bruise your legs a little bit because, of course, it's water over limestone, and the limestone is a soft rock, but it's not that soft. So putting in the car, putting in the big shapes, as the painters always say, and I know there's going to be a highlight on the top of the car because there's a whole lot of reflected light off those buildings, and it catches the car, and the car is very shiny, so you're going to get some highlights, even though the car is in partial shade. And then putting in other car windshields. I put in the windshield and then put in the shadow underneath the car, and then finish it up later if I want to leave it in. So I'm putting a bunch of windshields in where I figured cars might go. Then I moved back to put some windows in on the buildings, and these windows are very ornate. It's a brick building, beautiful brick building. The windows are very ornate, so they have, I think they're called lentils below them, and it's all made out of stone. So they have these stone lentils in, and then the windows are wood, and they have the lentils on the top and the bottom. So I've laid those in, and then the very top of the building has a yellow kind of paint job on the wood at the very top of the building, so I've laid that in as well. And because it's yellow and it's similar color to the yellow brick buildings to the left, then it's a bright color. And then here I'm just putting in where the windows are going to be. There are multiple windows, and I think I got the number right, but I'm not fussing over that. And then I'm going to 2 stories of windows, and then below is retail. The retail shops have large windows and awnings, so I'm just laying in quickly some of the windows that are the dark color, and the windows for the stores are quite dark because they're in shade, and not a lot of lights on at this point for some reason, and just making some adjustments there. Then I think I'm going to lay in some windows. I'm counting the windows there, so I'm going to lay in some windows there, and they have some sills and some ornate brickwork above them, so all of that gets into kind of a cast shadow situation because the brick is very beautiful and very ornate, and shadows are cast from it, which I presume is the architectural idea. And then similarly, I'm going to throw in the sills and the window frames, and all of that are casting shadows because the sun is raking across them. So there'll be darks where the windows are, and in the shadow I just put lights in because there are going to be lights as well. The windows are mostly painted white, so I put the white on the dark in order to help me find it later on, and then I'll probably put some cast shadows in there as well. At this point I've got the darks in, so I'm laying in some lights. There are posts that are white granite and other kinds of materials, and the posts are all laid in white and just very, very loosely, because I want to keep my whole painting style is extremely loose. Some people say it's too loose. Too loose-Lautrec. I don't know. Anyway, at the top of the street there are some other buildings in sun. Put those in. I'm going to put in the windows here on the left, and I'm making those fairly bright, and I'm going to make them even brighter towards the end of the picture, because I wanted something on the left to hold us in, yet I didn't want the eye to be distracted from the buildings on the right, which is kind of the main theme of this sunset. But in the end, even though I brightened them up considerably, they seem to work. They hold your eye, and yet the eye goes over to the yellow, maybe because it's all a yellow color, not sure. Laying in some car color, laying in the bridge railing, laying in some plants that are planted on the bridge. There's a whole bunch of window boxes, or bridge boxes, I should say. Here's a white truck, laying in the body color of the white truck very, very quickly, and then having a look. Every once in a while, oh, this is my number 14 brush, and that particular brush is a watercolor brush, and I use it for fine work. It's very soft bristles. It's a faux sable, like it's not really a sable. A number 14 sable would probably cost about $300. This thing was expensive enough, but it's a very lovely brush. It holds its shape, and so for details like putting in railings or posts that are thin, or fence posts or lamp posts that are way up the street that have to be extremely thin, decorative work. It holds a lot of paint because it's a number 14, and so I'm just laying in a bunch of stuff. There's a sign here that I'm going to paint some words on later on. Then I go back to the bristle brush and just laying in the awnings with the bristle brush, and they're going to be yellow and blue and have some white on them. And the awnings are really, they're not there in the picture at all if you see the thing on the left-hand side, but I needed some variety, and I needed some distraction. So I laid in the awnings, because the awnings are there, but they just weren't furled out. They were furled up. But I like them better furled out. So painter's privilege, I just said, well, fuck it. We're going to furl those awnings out. And they make some lovely stripes, so you can put any kind of stripe you like on them. And it kind of picks up from the windows, the pattern of the windows and the pattern of the awnings makes a nice call and response kind of thing. Here I'm just putting more windows in, and also trying to get the shapes right, refining the shapes a bit. I've got more work to do on the shadows. As you can see, that the building that's in shadow there may not be dark enough, so I'll probably change that later on. And where you see the horizontal whites, there where streets go through, and there's usually a bit more light where there aren't buildings, but as it turns out, that white is going to be too white, and I'm going to end up adjusting that as well down to a kind of a sunny yellow. So here I'm putting some more reflected light on the concrete posts. They're actually brick piles that are topped off with concrete. A little more work on the car, and I'll work more on the car later on as well. I'm not happy with the shape of the car, but the car is not really the focal point of the picture at all. So I don't want to do too much in the car and make it too interesting, because then the eye will not get past the car, and we'll be looking at something that really isn't the point. The point is going to be to drag you up into those hot sun passages on the buildings. I love putting red taillights in, so I'm putting some red taillights in, putting the wheels on the truck and the cast shadow underneath the truck. Cast shadows, to do a car, you need to connect the cast shadows, and they run from wheel to wheel, and then depending on where the car is in relation to the sun, you either have entire cast shadow under the car. Usually it looks better to show a little light under the car with your cast shadow, which you can see in the car in the middle ground. You can see that there's cast shadow and a bit of light there. The other two you can't see the shadows at all. Lightening up the sidewalk because I felt it was too dark. There's a whole bunch of light gets reflected back off the buildings that are in sun, and there's quite a lot of window, so there's light kind of sparkling everywhere, which is cool. And then I'm putting a little sparkling light up because there's white glass up in those lamps, and then I'm putting white on the awnings, which isn't really natural, but I'm going to see how it goes because I want them to be kind of bright. And I like to put little dots all over the place. I learned that from a California painter named Jeremy Mann. And I call these things Jeremy Mann dots. He puts lovely little spots of color or white all around his pictures, and it adds life and animation. You just have to make sure that it makes sense, and you usually know if you put a white dot in and it looks like somebody put a white dot on a finished painting and it shouldn't be there, then you can just take it off. But if they look normal and they look natural and they look as if they're conveying some information, then you just leave them. And I'm not unhappy with the awnings, and I'm putting a little bit of cast shadow on the sidewalks. Here I wasn't happy with the sky, it just seemed too dull. And so I wasn't sure why it was dull, whether it was too cold, so I laid in some yellow. My go-to sky is often a bright yellow sky, which is what Turner did a lot. And nobody could paint sky like Turner, so my default position is I usually, if it's looking all fucked up, then I put in a yellow sky and see if that solves it. In this case it didn't, and so when I got the yellow sky and it looked way too bright and it was taking over the picture in a way, because it looked as if there was some kind of fog in the sky or something. So I wasn't happy with that. So what I did was I cooled it off a little bit later with some more blue. Here I'm putting highlights and there are bright passages and more reflective passages on the sidewalk. So I'm putting that in, animating the windows a little more on the cast shadow side. And as I said, I'm not going to be happy with that. Here I'm putting the letters on the sign. And the way I do it is I start in the middle of the word. Like the word is Ganaraskis, so I start with the R. And I start with the R and finish it, and then I work backwards from the middle to the beginning of the word. And that way you don't end up running out of runway or running out of real estate, and you got your word in, and you still have 3 letters to go, and you got no place to put it. So I always start in the middle of the word, in the middle of the sign, and work right and then work back left, and that usually works out pretty well. Here I'm just adding more cast shadows in the windows because there are them. And then, what else? Oh yeah, there's these lentils, and they reflect a lot of light. They're bright white, so I'm putting those in a little brighter where they're in the sun, and see how that goes. And every time you put something bright like that in, it changes all the values, so it's kind of an adjustment stage at this point. I'm putting darks into the cast shadow, and I'm not going to like that at all. There I am not liking the sky, so I'm scrubbing around in it, and I always stand back about 10 or 15 feet and see how it looks from the back. I think I'm putting more yellow in, which I'm not going to like, but the neat thing about all this is that with acrylic, I'm going to have, at this point it's my 3rd layer, so when you keep adding layers of glaze or scumble, it adds visual interest, so I'm not unhappy with the fact that it's multiple layers. 1 layer of sky often looks boring and amateurish. Here I am warming up that red building. I really love red, and I put red in wherever I like. I don't give a shit whether it looks right or not. I just like it. And people say, well, that's not the color of the building. Well, too bad. The whole point of making a painting is to make a painting that's interesting and fun, and it looks good. And so being slavishly dedicated to painting what you see is okay if you're Claude Monet, but I'm not Claude Monet, and I like my paintings to sing. So the way I do that is I add red, very often red trucks, red buildings, red cars, that kind of thing. So I'm putting red in, even in the cast shadows, because cast shadows sometimes need to be warm. They go dead on you, and they can go dead because they're not warm enough. So it's always a good excuse to lay red. And as you can see, the red is very, very bright, but it's actually working in the context of the values. It makes more sense, the bright red makes more sense with the bright yellow for some reason. Maybe because the whole thing is so bloody high key. In fact, the yellow is way too yellow, but I'm going to see if I can pull it off. And so I'm just going to keep it right to the end and not give up on it by adjusting everything else. The only white I've put in, the only bright white I've put in so far is the top of the car roof. And it looks brightest because it's set against black. And if you want to make white look white, you have to set it against a very dark color. Otherwise, it's not going to look white at all. And similarly, if you want darks to look darks, you've got to juxtapose them immediately in the vicinity with lights. It's that whole simultaneous contrast, lights and darks. So if things on your paintings aren't looking light enough, it's because you don't have any darks in it. And they're comparatively light. So here's the finished painting. You can see I scumbled blue into the sky. There's the sign, which says Ganaraskin. It's out of focus. Sorry about that. This is my first video, by the way, of painting. And then because I'm in so close, the camera's fucked up the actual color. It's not that yellow. But you can see the sky. I've scumbled in blue.
So that's the 16 by 20 acrylic on canvas board of the sunset on Walton Street. Hope you enjoyed it. And it was just an experiment. I hope it isn't too rough to watch.